Welcome back, everyone. I have returned from 2 amazing weeks in the United Kingdom. I was supposed to be back the day before yesterday, but WestJet decided we needed to spend the night in Toronto and get home 24 hours later than we were supposed to. Long story, won't get into all of it, but we are home now. So I am ready to get right back at to the daily content. Probably going to be overloaded with some United Kingdom content, both history and also some original history stuff, reactions, a little bit of both. As we get back in the swing of things, bear with me. I'm still on Glasgow time right now, so it's going to be a few days before I adjust from the jet lag, but feeling pretty good right now. So we're going to dive into a little bit of Scottish history today. I have been fascinated by the clan system after spending a week in Scotland, especially in the Highlands. I've got some personal ties, like a lot of Americans do, to some of these families, so I am interested to dive into this a little bit more. I think I have a bit of an understanding of it after being there for a week and doing kind of a deep dive into the history. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We'll definitely be looking at some other historical topics from the UK, including possibly some Roman history in the UK. So check that out. Check out some of the quick videos that I've already uploaded from my time over there. Those are all excerpts from what will be larger videos that will be coming down the road. So let's go ahead and dive into this video from HistoryMarche. As always, the link is in the description to their original content. Please go check them out and give them a like and subscribe. Let's dive in.
If you ask anyone today what the first thing is that comes to mind when they think of Scotland, the answer you will probably hear, from anyone outside of Scotland at least, is the clans. For potentially 1,000 years, the clans of the Scottish Highlands, and some in the Lowlands, effectively controlled the lands and people of the nation.
So, first things first, for those not real familiar with Scottish history, and I know we've got a lot of folks in Scotland who follow this channel, and you guys are much more familiar with this than I will ever be, so help me out here. There is a very real divide between the Lowland clans and the Highland clans. The Lowlands, it's kind of right in this area. It's just to the north of where the major population centers are. Edinburgh, which is the capital city, and then Glasgow, which is over here further to the west. And Scotland's largest city. Those are a big chunk. I mean, that's over 1 million people between those two cities, and Scotland's only like a little over 5 million people total population. And size-wise, Scotland is smaller. I think it's about 2/3 the size of Ohio. Ohio's around 45,000 square miles. I think Scotland's about 30,000 square miles total. So that gives you a little sense of the size. But yeah, there's kind of a natural divide in this area. There's a political divide as far as the administration districts go, but the actual divide between Lowland and Highland, I think, is a little further south than the political, the way the maps are drawn. But it's right in this area here. So folks like the Wallace clan, for example, which we all are familiar with, William Wallace, that's actually a Lowland clan. My closest connection to Scotland is through the Hamiltons. Yes, Alexander's family, and that's a Lowland clan as well. Most of the clan names that have Mac in them, not all, but most, are Highland clans, specifically northwest Scotland. But yeah, Lowlands, Highlands, and you can tell the difference when you get there. I mean, it gets really big, really fast with the Highlands, and they are high. And some of the most beautiful ground I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I lost track of the number of times I said wow when we got into the Highlands. It was incredible.
Today they remain as a rebranded kinship meant to unite people of shared ancestry and heritage. In this video we will look at what happened to the Scottish clans and how did the Scottish clan system collapse. Before we begin, it helps to first understand how the clan system of old worked. Although Scottish historians generally feel that we don't have an extensive amount of knowledge about the structure of the clans as a unit, we do know the basics. It's believed that the earliest clans were established around the start of the 12th century, and some of these early clans were actually founded by foreigners.
Again, this is a really interesting time in history, both for England and also Scotland, because this is right after the Norman invasion of England. So, one of the things you'll notice right away when you go to the UK is how much of the history really goes back to the 1060s, for example. The Tower of London, the castles in the north like York Castle. A lot of these go right back to the 1060s, because when William the Conqueror invades and becomes King of England, he really steps out to put his mark on things. And similar things happening in Scotland, where the 12th century is where you really start to see Scottish identity developing as we know it today. And of course, it's then into the 13th century, and then even in the 14th century that we see folks like Robert the Bruce come along. But the kings of Scotland are really starting to make their mark at this time, and it's interesting that that's about the time the clan system really develops, at least what we know of it.
For example, one of the largest and most powerful clans throughout the Highlands, and even spanning through the Lowlands, were the Gordons. Today, this clan is frequently referred to as the House of Gordon, oftentimes in reference to the fact that they actually began as a family of foreigners, likely from Normandy. The Camerons of Clan Cameron were additionally Anglo-Normans to start, and others such as the Galbraiths were descendants of ancient Britons.
And he makes a good point there, too. I mean, there's really no such thing. In the United States, we take for granted that we're a melting pot, right? Most people in the U.S. are not purely one thing. My wife's grandfather was 100% Hungarian because his parents were immigrants. But then you mix in some German, some English, some Irish. Her grandfather on her dad's side was pretty much 100% Irish, but then everything else is really mixed in English. And it's really a melting pot. But, the British Isles are the same way. There's a lot of mixing between Ireland and Scotland, for example. You've got the Norman French coming in. You've got, of course, a heavy Scandinavian presence, especially in the north and the east of England. Up in here, like in the Hebrides, we spend a lot of time on the Isle of Skye, which is right here, and it's is it there? I can't really tell on this map, but it's in this area. And that was mainly the MacDonalds, but also the MacLeods. So it could be right here. And that was heavily influenced by the Scandinavians. The East as well, places like York. And then, you get the Norman French coming up even into Scotland. So there's a lot of mixing of blood. So, there's really no such thing as just kind of pure Scottish or English or Welsh or any of that stuff.
And the Frasers, one of the most popular today, were French. Maybe because of this, or just because of the way the nation was at that time, many clansmen were known to be loyal to their clan first and country second, which in itself tells us a lot about the system.
So you're going to see a lot of echoes, if you're an American, of Scottish influence and the heritage of that influencing especially the American South. The American South was very heavily populated by, I don't know why I said immigration there, populated by immigrants from what we call Scots-Irish areas. So Scots-Irish would be like Ulster, which is Northern Ireland today. Generally Northern Ireland, and a lot of that was Scottish heritage, and a lot of Scotland was settled by people from Ireland, and you see a lot of the way they did things influencing things. So in the South, more than in the North, you had people in the early days of the United States having more of a loyalty to their state than to the nation. Similar to loyalty to a clan versus loyalty to a king of Scots, for example. And you even see the way the clans have their wars between clans influencing things. Like my family comes from Eastern Kentucky, and it was very heavily Scottish. And you have feuds, the most famous of which being the Hatfields and the McCoys. But my family, my great-grandmother was a Holbrook. And there was a feud that was much bloodier than the Hatfields and the McCoys called the Holbrook-Underwood feud. And these feuds between these clans in Eastern Kentucky, these family groups, are very reminiscent of what was happening in the old country for those folks.
These men, whether through pride or another kind of loyalty, were willing to fight and even die for their clan and chief. And the chief, who served as the leader of each clan, was often viewed with the same esteem as royalty by his kinfolk.
And a lot of these clans actually still have chiefs to this day. And, a lot like in other things, it's more of an honorary or a ceremonial thing, but a lot of these chiefs still live in the castles that are the seat of their family. We saw the castle for the chief of the MacLeods when we were on the Isle of Skye, which is, oh my gosh, so amazingly beautiful. So, a lot of that's still true. And a lot of folks, if you're Americans or even Scottish or other places, you're going to see names that are familiar here. A lot of these names are last names that Americans have to this day. Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland. Of course, Campbell is a name that I'm very familiar with here. I know a lot of Camerons. I know a lot of MacLeods. Grant, of course, is there, although I think Ulysses S. Grant's family came from England, not Scotland. And you'll see that a lot of these clans have multiple territories, and they actually were broken down further very often. There would be, for example, the MacDonalds from Glencoe, who were very famously massacred in 1692. But there were also MacDonalds from Skye and MacDonalds from other places.
Many members of the clans who were not directly related to the chief would also take his surname as a show of loyalty and a way of securing their protection from the clan, because that is essentially what these groups were meant to do. When it comes to organization, instead of being a typical feudal land-owning society, the clan system was based on relationships and loyalty. Whether family members to the chief, septs, or others who would be brought into a clan, the job of the clan was to protect these people and their holdings in exchange for complete loyalty to the chief and favors such as fighting his battles whenever called upon.
So in a lot of ways it echoes the feudal system. It's really not all that different, but it's much more about families than about the land itself.
And battles were common in the clan system, due to the limited usable land within Scotland at the time, and the vast number of clans whose territories often butted up against each other. Conflict was a normal occurrence, and clansmen would battle fiercely in the name of their clan and chief. The kings of Scotland were also known to take advantage of friendships that they would build with certain chiefs, later calling upon them to bring their troops into battle for the crown's cause as well. Essentially, though oftentimes the cause of bloody warfare and tit-for-tat massacres, the clan system was remarkably successful at establishing what in some cases resembled individual kingdoms, or other times comprehensive family units that would piece together nearly the whole of the Scottish Highlands and parts of the Lowlands. But, as evident by the current structure of Scotland, the clan system has been dead and gone for some time, and this was not by chance.
I was going to say, it was a very intentional act, and a lot of it, I don't know where they're going with this, but I think a lot of it goes to the Glorious Revolution, when William and Mary take the throne of England and Scotland, which at the time were still two separate political entities, but joined under one crown. It was another 20 years or so until they were formally joined by an act of union as Great Britain.
The collapse of the Scottish clan system is generally viewed to have begun after the final clash of the Jacobite uprising. But this is not entirely true. The clans had still existed and were more or less alive and well by the 18th century, but they were already beginning to change. One influence that contributed to their slow evolution was the actions of James VI once he took the throne of the Scots and in England. Untrusting of the clans.
So, just background for those not familiar. Scotland has its wars for independence. Robert the Bruce, very famously, who is the real Braveheart, by the way. That title Braveheart, actually, in Scotland, they use it for Robert the Bruce, not William Wallace. Robert the Bruce becomes the King of Scotland after a period of a lot of instability. Gives them complete independence from England, allies himself heavily with France, which is called the Old Alliance, and they're able to keep their independence. And it's in the very early part of the 17th century when Queen Elizabeth I dies That's the end of the Tudor dynasty because 3 of Henry VIII's children sat on the throne of England, but he never had any grandchildren. So at least no legitimate grandchildren. So now you go back to Henry VIII's sister, who married King James IV of Scotland, and it's their great-grandson, King James VI of Scotland, who is next in line to the throne. And so he becomes King of England after already having been the King of Scotland for a while. So now England and Scotland in the early part of the 1600s are united under one crown.
He started to require that their chiefs attend court annually in Edinburgh, in addition to other provisions involving some Highlanders being educated in the Lowlands and adopting the new religion of England. Life in the capital and beyond had a swift effect on these clansmen and leaders, who had never really had to live the kind of life that was required of them when they came to the court and Lowlands. Many view this as one of the true early factors that began to weaken the clan structure through the changing of its chiefs and members. But still, the biggest blow to the clans and the world they had created came after the 45 Rebellion.
So a lot of Scottish history, and we heard this over and over again in our time in Scotland, is especially in the Highlands, is all about the Jacobite Rebellions, and those go to the late 1680s, early 1690s. That's when you have things like the Glencoe Massacre, which is directly tied to the very first Jacobite Rebellions. Jacobite just means, I'm really digressing a lot here, but William and Mary overthrow King James II, I think it was, as king. James II was Catholic at a time when in England they were firmly heading down the road of being Protestant. And so James, Jacob is like, I think, the Latin word for James, and so Jacobite just means that these are followers, these are folks who believe that James and his descendants should be on the throne, not William and Mary, and then that line, which eventually goes by the middle of the 1700s, is the Hanover dynasty, because they had to skip over a ton of people in the line of succession to get to I think, Electress Sophia of Hanover, who was the first in line to the throne who was Protestant. And so then her son, George I, becomes King of England, even though he's German, doesn't speak a lick of English. And so for 60 years or so, there's significant upheaval as descendants of James II and his line are trying to get them back on the throne. Bonnie Prince Charlie is a guy you'll hear a lot about, and the clans were heavily involved in this. And part of what the government had to do in order to put down these Jacobite rebellions was really clamp down on the clans.
The Battle of Culloden, the final bloody and devastating battle of the rebellion, which put an end to the hopes of Bonnie Prince Charlie and all who supported him, marked the final hours of not only the Jacobite dream, but also of the Scottish clans, as everyone knew them. Given the incredible number of Highlanders who had participated in the uprising against the British Crown, and the fact that these clansmen were not by any means known for giving up so easily, the British authorities began to do whatever they could to collapse the entire clan system that gave these Highlanders their power to begin with. Around this time, a large chunk of what soon became the early Scottish diaspora left the Highlands for Ulster, the New World colonies, or elsewhere.
So again, when you hear about Scots-Irish, which is a term that gets used a lot in the United States to describe people's heritage, Ulster is what today, like I said, roughly Northern Ireland today. And a lot of the Scots went there at that time, but they had gone there before that, and they had been very intentionally sent there to kind of make Ireland more Protestant. But yeah, back in the late 1680s, early 1690s, when William and Mary are trying to put their stamp on the throne, they required loyalty oaths from a lot of the Scottish clans, from their chiefs. And when they didn't get one as quickly as they should have, that's when you have the issue where Clan Campbell goes down and slaughters a bunch of the MacDonalds at Glencoe. A lot of songs written about that, things like that. We're going to be doing a video on the history of what happened to the Glencoe massacre. But yeah, they're trying to rebrand Scotland as a nation rather than a collection of clans.
These immigrants would later play a significant role in the fate of the clans, but for now, we need to take a look at what they were fleeing from. Once the 45 rebellion was crushed, one of the most immediate actions taken by the British Crown was the passing of the Act of Proscription, which came into effect on August 1st, 1746, only a few months after the Culloden disaster. It was essentially an updated version of an earlier disarming act that had a similar aim, and the goal now was to completely assimilate and suppress the clans, their system, culture, and members. In addition to attempting to ban the Highlanders from possessing weaponry, this time the Monumental Dress Act was added, which is pointed to by many historians as being one of the most significant and damning actions taken by the British government in their assimilation efforts.
So what is this all about? This is about control. And as long as these clans have influence and power, they're harder to control. So this is the government asserting its control. And, again, this is where, you understand a lot of the American South and their general opposition to strong government control. The idea of loyalty to a state rather than to a nation. And you see that to this day. The names of the parties change and the issues change. But from the very earliest days, that Scottish influence in the American South, the clan system influence, can be seen to this day, where people have a real aversion to strong governmental authority.
The Dress Act entirely banned the wearing of Highland dress by anyone outside of the army, where the Black Watch Regiment had already established its own tradition of a kilted uniform. This meant that, although many of the clan tartans we know today were made after the Dress Act would later be repealed, Highlanders could no longer wear the tartan of their time, and their kilts would also be unacceptable. And the punishment for non-compliance? Jail. And if any such Highlander continued to wear their traditional dress just once more, indentured servitude overseas. But this wasn't...
They called that being sentenced to transportation. That's what you see in the record. Sentenced to transportation. That meant they transported you off the islands and you got sent to Georgia in North America, or you got sent to a place like Australia.
The only thing that helped the Crown dismantle the clan system and its culture. The Highland clearances also had a devastating impact on Highland life.
We heard a lot about that when we were there too. The Highland clearances. You have these landowners, dukes, a lot of them, figuring out the most profitable way to use their land. And so in places like the Isle of Skye, where you have a lot of the MacLeods, to this day, when you go there, there's 10,000 people who live on the island of Skye, but there's 100,000 sheep. And that's because during these Highland clearances, they cleared a lot of the people off the land because sheep were more profitable than people were.
As the Scots knew it. The Highland clearances began in the 18th century, following Culloden, and went on for roughly a century, marking a period of sudden and excess emigration of Scottish Highlanders from the Highlands. For the most part, this was due to different effects of the agriculture revolution in Scotland, but there was one factor that highlighted the already occurring changes to the clan system as it once was. In the past, the clans had given their members the inalienable right to rent land within their clan's territory, which would mean that the tenants who were forced to emigrate during the clearances by their landlords or chiefs were essentially being betrayed by their own clan. Something that in the past would have been unfathomable. But this was a shift that had potentially begun all the way back in 1609 with the Statutes of Iona, when James VI started his campaign to change the clans and their chiefs from Edinburgh. Despite the shock and anger from many clansmen, the damage had already been done, and the ball was rolling. The Highlands would never be the same. Even though the Dress Act would be repealed before the close of the 18th century, and Scotland would later undergo a period of traditional revival. Life would never recover for the clans. Highland dress would eventually be restored as a traditional wear for special occasions, but it was no longer daily wear for really anyone. The clans no longer held the territory or power that they once had. The Gaelic language was fading under the growing use of English in the Lowlands and Highlands.
So I'm curious to hear from our friends in Scotland. I know that that language is still spoken by, I think, like 60,000 people in Scotland, much more prevalent in Ireland. I've always pronounced it Gaelic, but I heard it pronounced as Gaelic by the people of Scotland, at least the folks in Glasgow that I spoke with. They called it Gaelic. So how is that pronounced? I want to try and stick to the real pronunciation as much as possible. My whole life I've said Gaelic until I went to Scotland.
And with vast numbers of clansmen having left the country, or even the continent entirely, it was clear that the days of the clan system in Scotland were no more. But this would not be the end of the clans entirely. We mentioned earlier that some of the diaspora had left while the clan structure that they had always known was still alive.
Yeah, Nova Scotia is New Scotland. That's literally what it means.
Little did they know it, these Highlanders were about to play a crucial role in preserving their traditions and heritage, and making it a global phenomenon. Upon arriving in their new countries, for many, their clan identity was all that they knew. Remember that a large number of these Highlanders were loyal first to their clan, and then to their nation. Not only this, but the biggest uniting factor between these immigrants in a new world across the ocean, far from all they'd ever called home, was their status as clansmen. This gave them an instant community in a strange place, and can be demonstrated on a large scale by the American and Canadian Highland Games Festival, dating all the way back to the early 1800s. Furthermore, since clan life was all that these immigrants knew, it also accounted for the only heritage they had to pass down to their descendants in their new homes. This is why even today, we see Highland Games, official clan organizations, kilt and tartan wearing and so on, really anywhere that a decent chunk of the earlier diaspora went. So, though rebranded and modernized, by all means in the diaspora, the clans live on. But the case in Scotland differs. Given the way that the nation itself changed and adapted following the emigration of the early diaspora, it's no surprise that the heritage of modern Scots did as well. Of course, some Scottish citizens today still speak Gaelic or celebrate their clan, but for the most part, this area of history created a startling divide between Scots and the diaspora. Although many clans still have their chiefs in Scotland, who often directly or indirectly supervise or recognize their clan's official organizations and overseas branches today.
So Dunvegan Castle is the one that I saw when we were on the island of Skye, and it is still lived in by the chief today.
Most Scots view it all as a thing of the past. While the heritage of the diaspora remains encapsulated in the days of the mighty clans, today's Scots have a whole new identity and heritage that was birthed after the collapse of the clan system. Because, even though the tradition of the clans may live on abroad or at home, the reality is that the true Scottish clan system fell apart nearly 3 centuries ago, and it will never be what it once was.
That was good. That was interesting. I learned some things I didn't know. And like I said, we're going to be diving into more and more of this over the next couple of weeks, because I'm very much in the mode of being fascinated by this after having just spent 2 weeks, a week in England and a week in Scotland. So more to come, more history from those places to come. I'll be uploading some videos. Still got to start getting some videos up to you from my trip to the Netherlands and Belgium a couple of months ago, so that'll be coming soon as well. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and a big shout out and thank you to all of our patrons for your continued support. Thank you. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.